Can you see it? Can you see the presentation, please?
No problem, no problem.
Okay, perfect. So my presentation is about the diachronic study of the 20th century. And you could think that this is not a great deal. This is not something very special, because if you make historical linguistics, history is everything. But in practice, people always thought that the 20th century was like the end of the road. And I'm going to show you how I came to the idea that there was something hidden in the history of the 20th century that is interesting for linguistic research. And let me start with a particular case, how it all started. Well, everything started with a newspaper article. A linguist, Spanish Emilio Lorenzo, wrote a tribune on the development of a Spanish discourse marker. This discourse marker is osea, which can be translated more or less like well. And he was talking about his personal experience with this discourse marker. And he said the following. He said, when I was a youngster, osea was a normal discourse marker. And a normal discourse marker for him was a reformulation marker. A reformulation marker is a sign that says that the first formulation of something is not exact, and it substitutes it with a second formulation. For instance, he trusts his friends, that is, those who stand with him when he needs them. So what does friend mean? We reformulate it with those who stand with him. This osea had this, for him, right meaning, basic meaning, which was to express this idea. But he said that around, when I was 20, he said, he was a teacher, and said, in post-war children, remember there was a civil war in Spain between 1936 and 1939. So we are in 1944-45. He said, in post-war children, a use of I mean was spreading, which didn't clarify anything because it served as an absolute beginning of the intervention. And he made this example. So a teacher says, let's see, child, tell us the rivers of Spain. And the child hesitated and said, I mean, osea, the rivers of Spain are this and this and that. Here, we can see that there are not two things to reformulate, so we don't have these friends reformulated as those who stand with him, because this is the absolute initiation of his term. So this I mean cannot work as a reformulation marker. It's rather a hesitation marker. So this means that in post-war children, there was a new polysemy arising. And he then said, in the 50s, I observed how this trend affected the students in the 4th and 6th grade exams. So he says, later on, as those children became older, they started to write it in the exams. So this is interesting. It started as an oral usage, and then it came to written. He said, the trend later spread to college students, thesis defenders, candidates for high school and university professorships. So he says it's spreading. We can see as those children grow up, they start spreading this use. And he said, perhaps this spread was the reason why some prestigious writers, parodying the celebrities and certain groups of teenagers, extended this fashion to the end segments of the sentence. So this means Now it's spread, and now it becomes popular, famous. And lately, he says, but the latest evolution of this fleeting formula consists of placing it behind the equivalent term or a phrase with a playful intent. And the example was this. Mingote, it's the name of a journalist, was left-wing. I mean, this means someone said this journalist was a left-wing, and I don't agree with it. Mingote era de izquierdas, o sea, it means I don't agree with that. So now again, this is a new polysemy. There is a different position. It's in the end of the term, and it has a different meaning. So far, this is what this linguist wrote. And when I read this, I thought, okay, he wrote this tribune as his personal experience with this discourse marker. He talked about a fashion, a trend. But what if we read this tribune diachronically? What does this mean? This means that the normal use is the author's use. As you know, we tend to consider normal what is normal for us. And taking into account that this linguist was born in 1918, in the 40s, he would be like 24, 25, a young teacher. So his linguistic code was already established. So this means that until 1940, osea was a reformulation marker. But what he says is that in the 40s, osea developed a polysemy, and it became a hesitation marker in initial position in oral terms. And this is something very detailed. It's a very detailed remark about how polysemies are created and where polysemies are created. In 3 to 5, we can see how this new polysemy spreads between 1950 and 1970. And in the late 70s, osea becomes an intensification marker in final position in written discourse. And again, we have a new polysemy linked to a specific discourse position, and it's linked to a specific register. It's in written form. Well, what does this mean? This means that if osea comes to Spanish language as a discourse marker around 1600, and I studied this, so I can tell you this is true, this evolution only ended 40 years ago. So the first dating of old and sea starts in 1200. It starts as a discourse marker in 1700, but this road ended only 40 years ago. When we think about discourse markers, we tend to consider that discourse markers ended their way like 100 years ago, 150 years ago, but this happened yesterday. So this meant that there was something in the 20th century that was worth studying. And the same Emilio Lorenzo said it would be interesting to document the process of penetration of a construction that, captured 50 years ago by the child population, has become a stylistic trait imitated in Spain by prestigious individuals. So this linguist encouraged us to document this process of penetration. And this is exactly what we intend to do today. And to do this, we have to take a look at the 20th century as a distinct space for linguistic change. So our next question, if any one of you has a question or something is not clear, you can interrupt me and ask whatever you want, okay? So if we consider that the 20th century is worth studying, is something distinct, different, we have to answer the question why. We have to justify this idea. So why the 20th century is something worth studying? And in what sense is this study different from the 19th or 18th century? Okay, let me introduce the book which I read. I studied in the university to learn the history of Spanish. I think we all have it's something cherished for all of us, the book that taught us the basics of the discipline. And this for me had something special. So I read it, I studied it when I was 21, 22. And in this book, the last chapter was called Contemporary Spanish or Present Day Spanish. And where did it start? It started on the 18th century. So what this book said was basically that from the 18th century to present day Spanish, no big changes had happened, so that everything could be packed together. Okay, this book was written in 1960 or so, but in the last years, diachronic research has paid attention to the 19th century in Spanish, showing that there are different processes worth studying, like for instance, the development of press or the development of science. Those are facts with a big impact on Spanish language. So what I'm trying to do is to add a new chapter to this book, not about the 19th century, but about the 20th century. And this is my way to make an homage to my master, to the one who taught me the history of Spanish by adding a new chapter which couldn't exist when he wrote this book, because Spanish was already in the 20th century. So, okay, what is the state of the art about the 20th century? If we are classical diachronists, the 20th century is a period disregarded in diachronic studies. And there are good reasons to disregard it. Why? Okay, 1900 is called present-day English or present-day Spanish or present-day Chinese. And one way to consider present day is that linguists can project their intuition onto linguistic samples, because there would be no significant differences between my linguistic intuition of how, for example, a discourse marker worked in 1910 and the rule. Whereas if I am studying how Spanish or Chinese worked in the 14th century, one of the bans that the diachronist has is you cannot project your intuition into past stages of the language. And this is something very sound, but not for the 20th century. So if I can project my intuitions, this is not real diachrony. Second, there is not a problem in periodization of the language if we take the 20th century into account. This is the end of the road. This is the last stage. If we are in the 15th century or 13th century, we can consider, okay, is this Middle Age, is this Renaissance, but not with the 20th century. So for linguists, this was traditionally synchrony. And the last idea is for the best linguists in the century, the 1900, was their synchrony. So they didn't have a historical perspective, but now we have it. Okay, this is what happens in diachronic studies, but what if we go to contextualization studies of something newer, something more pragmatic? Well, the 20th century is the end of the road, is the place where the last change is attested. So there are no big changes compared to old diachronists. And according to the literature, is not a special place to look at, either methodologically or descriptively. This means that we do not need new tools to study this 20th century. And descriptively, we're not going to find anything especially interesting. So standard linguistic tools can be used here. We do not need to develop anything new. Okay, I don't agree with this view. Why? So let me summarize what are my reasons to defend this diachronic study of the 20th century. So what I am trying to do is to set out what are the most important features, at least for Spanish language, in the 20th century. Imagine a century is a place where there are wars, social changes, but this does not affect in the same way language. So if we only take into account language, what are the most important facts of the 20th century, at least for Spanish? And you can make your mental translation into Chinese and adapt my observations to Chinese. Okay, what is the most important fact for the development of language in the 20th century? Clearly, to me, this is the first time in history where there are records of oral samples. For any other stage in the history of the language, we can record how people spoke. But in the 20th century, we can. And this is something really extraordinary. Imagine that you could record Lao Tse or Confucius or your best writers. You can't. But for the 20th century, you can. And this makes a difference. We can study diachronic oral records of real speakers. And this makes a change. But there is a problem, and we will talk about this later. Oral recordings are scattered and have to be collected because they are not yet perceived as something worth keeping. So if we are going to make research on the diachrony of the 20th century, we'll need to go through a phase of, I have called oral archaeology, and look for the oldest registers of oral samples recorded in our country. Second reason, very important, crucial. The 20th century is the time where full literacy is attained in developed societies. And this means something very important. All speakers can produce texts and understand written texts. Never before in the history of humankind this had been possible. We can see it on a graph. At the beginning of the 20th century, and this is stats for the whole world, and this is very different in different geographical areas, only around 15% of the population was literate. At the end of the century, this proportion has flipped, and the proportion of literate people grew up. And if we go to the most decisive stage, it's between 1920 and 1960. And this makes a change, because never ever in history we had so many writers and so many readers as in this century. But not only this, third reason, it is not just that speakers can read and write, but access to higher education is massive at the end of the century in developed societies. And what does this mean? This means that all speakers can produce and understand complex text. It's not just the basics. It's people who can read newspapers, who can read books, who can write books. And without this, we wouldn't be able to understand things like, for instance, the extension of scientific vocabulary into spontaneous language. You talk about quantum, you talk about cells, you talk about inflation. I wonder how would it sound if you travel in time back to 1900 and talked about all those things. I think speakers would look at you, even literate people, saying you speak very strange. Why? Because the ability to produce and understand complex text changes our perception of language. And this is something unique that happened at the end of the 20th century. As you can see here, this is statistics for the United States. You can see that at the end of the century, around 24% of the population is college graduate or higher, whereas high school graduates go up to 83%. And this is very important. It's not just that you can read and write a basic text. It's that you can read and write a very complex text. And this changes the way speakers are and the way speakers interact. And this leads us to pragmatics, of course. We're not done yet. There are other good reasons to defend this diachronic study of the 20th century. The 20th century is the time of radio in the 30s, 20s, and 30s, TV in the 60s, and cinema throughout the century. And today, with internet, internet methodologically would belong to the 21st century. We cannot imagine what impact, for instance, cinema had on every society. The fact that you can see images and stories and you can dream on them is something huge. Before the 20th century, only a few people could go to theater or to popular theaters. But during the 20th century, and thanks to cinema, all people, everyone in the world can have access to the best actors in the world by paying small ticket. And it changed the way people dreamt. And the impact of radio, TV, and cinema is yet to be studied from a linguistic perspective. For instance, as people can read newspapers, as people can listen to the radio, think of the radio. Radio can spread linguistic changes. If a radio broadcasting station is established in Beijing, and there is a special dialectal feature in Beijing, as speakers speak that feature, they can spread linguistic changes at a pace that was unprecedented before. But also media contribute to normalization processes, as Cuenca has shown. So if you want to ban a linguistic usage, you can spread this ban through media, either oral or written. And this also contributes to accept dialectal features. So your tolerance to different accents is higher because of this contact with media. But think about movies. Movies spread discourse traditions. I don't know if this happens to you, but some American movies seem very strange to me because characters say things that I would never say. For instance, I have a friend that has a problem, or are you talking to me? we all know this sentence. It's a threaten, but you have to learn that this is a threaten to understand it. In my culture, nobody's defying anyone by saying, "Are you talking to me?" But as this has been repeated for 40 years in many series, now I can see youngsters saying, "Are you talking to me?" And this is a way of performing a certain speech act that comes through the influence of cinema. Or do you have a problem? Okay, American movie, you're in a bar and there is this guy saying, "Hey, do you have a problem?" We never say, "Do you have a problem?" We don't quarrel like that. But as this is repeated over and over and over again, this speech act comes into our minds. So we could think that movies have had an impact on the way we talk because of those discourse traditions. But we also have gags. Gags are something very special, or even characters, the thought guy. Thought guy is, again, something very American, and it's not inside my culture. That through repetition in movies, it comes to my society. So this impact of movies in discourse traditions is yet to be studied. But again, the 20th century is the time where scientific vocabulary reaches orality. Like I said before, in words like inflation, quantic marketing, or wavelength. But also is the time of political propaganda and advertising. And advertising also had an impact on how we speak. And lately, the 20th century is the time of massive internal and external migrations. As economy grows, new industrial pools are created, and people travel from one place to another, and they share their dialects. So those reasons and many more reasons, I think they justify the diachronic study of the 20th century. So in conclusion, we can conclude that there is a case for a distinct pragmatic treatment of language change in the 20th century. Okay, I hope I have justified why. And now we're going to the question of how. If we are going to study the 20th century, must the methodology be the same, or is there some difference in the way we have to study language? Well, I think that the diachronic study of the 20th century poses important methodological restrictions. For instance, for the first time, researchers have access to audio records. This means radio, TV programs, social linguistic interviews, and so on. If you study the 19th century, you don't have access to oral records. So this is a different, distinct material. And the way you deal with it has to be methodologically established. And Ledov said some years ago in a very well-known paper that diachrony is the art of making good use of bad data. But in the 20th century, we have to make good use of excess of data. Why is this so? Because we have a huge population of text. Think of all the letters that have been written in the 20th century. Think of all the radio programs that have been broadcasted during the 20th century, TV programs, movies. How can a sound sample be built from such a big population? So what is the relationship between population and sample? This is not an easy question. But if we need to create, and I think we need to create oral diachronic corpora, I think we have two phases, two stages. First, until the 60s, we have absence of data. And from the 60s or 70s, we have to face the excess of data. What is in between? There is the invention of the type recorder. And the type recorder makes it possible to record someone down where he is. Before the invention of tape recorder, you had to record someone in a studio. Normal everyday speakers did not go to those studios. Only important people, politicians, writers, singers, or so. But from the 60s on, parents can record their children, their grandparents, their grandparents, and therefore we have too many materials. So for these diachronic corpora, we need to deal with absence of data, and we have to deal with excess of data. How can we do for this absence? We have to go to film archives or to other archives or to radio interviews. This is the phase or oral archaeology we are engaged in right now. And we're looking for where are the oldest recordings of Spanish or oldest oral recordings of Spanish. And it's a fascinating task. And from the excess phase, we have to choose and prioritize what do we want and how. And the problem is that there are oral data that cannot be studied because we cannot reach them. So we were talking about methodology. Why cannot be studied? Because there are no archives. For instance, underground press in the 70s, in the 80s, or comics for children that were very popular in Spain in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. They are not stored in a library. They're not stored anywhere. So you have to find them one by one, and this is not easy. Or the access is impossible. For instance, the oldest radio station in Spain is called Cadena Ser, and they have a huge archive, but they don't want to share it. So we cannot access to oral data from the 20s or the 30s because they don't let us. Hoping following years they exceed researchers to access it. Or documents can be studied, but have to be studied on the spot there. That is the National Radio of Spain. They have a good archive, but you have to go there to Madrid and listen to the programs, but you cannot take them back home. And this is again a problem. Or the documents are available, but not transcribed. And this happens with the Spanish TV. They have a good archive and you can take some documents, but then you have to transcribe it to make them useful for linguists. Or documents are transcribed with mistakes. We have a huge archive of all the newspapers written in Spain in the 19th and 20th century. But this is an OCR and is full of misspellings. For instance, I was looking for the word missile. Missile was invented in 1960. But the first recording of this word, according to this database, was 1902. And I said, oh my God, how is this possible? Well, there was a misspell between missile and mass. And of course, in 1902, they were talking about mass. But for the OCR, it was a missile. So those are things that have to be methodologically addressed if you want to make a sound oral diachronic corpus. So we have a paradox here. Linguists can make use of many collections of texts, but the access to linguistic corpora is limited. And we have to deal with this restriction before we can get a complete study of the 20th century. So what else can we do? Well, we can read with diachronic eyes descriptions that were synchronic at the time. For instance, we have sociolinguistic interviews recorded in Spain since 1960. And we have the same cities evaluated in the year 2000. So if we take those interviews in the 60s and the newer interviews, we have a diachronic study because there is a 40-year difference, and we can measure linguistic changes. And this is what researcher Crystal Guirado has made with the materials in Venezuela. But also with the linguistic descriptions made in different decades. So in the 20s, there were studies of oral Spanish, and those studies were replicated in the 80s. We can compare what the authors wrote in the 20s and what the authors wrote in the 80s. And if we add a third stage in 2022, we would have 60 years time and 40 years time, 3 dots, 3 stages. And this leads us to make a diachronic study. And also grammatical descriptions and novels and theater plays mimicking orality. There is something that happened in Spanish around the 70s, is that there was a ban on rude language. And this ban on rude language loosened. And this led spoken language to be reflected in novels and theater plays. And as you can follow historically how this ban is loosened, you can witness how swear words and popular expressions and dialectal expressions gradually appear in literature. So with diachronic eyes, you can also make a diachronic explanation of this fact that has been described but not studied diachronically. So as you can see, what we are doing is to think with new eyes all data. And this has to do with that definition of science, which is seeing what others have seen and thinking about things the others have not thought about. But it's not just data. New techniques are necessary to process those data. So some open questions, we have no answer for them today. How can oral corpora be organized so that data can be extracted semi-automatically? Yeah, our colleagues in computer science always promise they are going to automatically extract data from oral and written samples. With written samples, if the writing is standard, is okay. With oral data, we are still waiting. But it would be very useful because remember that we are facing that problem of the excess of data. Or how can a movie database turn into a linguistic corpus? We have a lot of movies, but this is a raw material. And for a linguist to use them, needs some transformations. So what kind of transformations do we have to do to turn a movie database into a linguistic movie database? And the same goes for any oral record. Or how can magazines, underground comics, or album covers be processed? We're trying to process humor journals, and we have a problem. When you take a comic, there is no sharp distinction of vignettes pages, sections, everything is meshed up, is mixed up. And the types of text are different, the sizes are different. There are drawings, there are text that looks like a drawing, and this cannot be captured by a standard OCR. Okay, you have a picture, but if you want to extract text from image, so far there are no programs that can extract this. So theoretical research on scanning is necessary for comics, for instance, to be processed. But comics are a rich source of information about language. And what can we learn from data mining? Data mining is developing right now, but it hasn't reached us. I'm sure in the following years, data mining would be an ally, but not now. Perhaps you will see it. I'm not sure that I will see it. Okay, so far so good. We have defended that the 20th century is worth studying, and we have talked about methodology. But you could think, okay, but does this issue affect the backbone of linguistics? Is there any basic linguistic problem that is touched by this issue? Is there a linguistic interest in studying this 20th century beyond the discovery and sampleism in discourse markers? Well, let's zoom in into a basic problem, which is the diffusion of linguistic change. I think it's general enough. Okay. As the 20th century has so many data, there is something we can do and we cannot do for any other stage. We can zoom into the acquisition and spread of linguistic changes at a scale that you cannot imagine. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Okay, this is a study made by one of my students. She was 20 years old, second grade student, and she analyzed the development of three words, word nurse and babysitter. In Spain, there are three words across different decades in the 20th century. And what you can see is that in the 20s, there is this nurse rising. In the 80s, there is this babysitter rising. And in the 90s, there is this kangaroo rising. This is very interesting because there are three correlated words for the same concept. But there is an interesting difference. Think about the society in the 20s. Who had a nurse? Of course, you had to be a rich family. And if you were a rich family, you hired a woman to take care of children. But remember that there is a civil war in Spain. And what happens? That there is poverty. And of course, the number of occurrences of nurse descend. And when it comes again, it doesn't reach its peak. But there is a new society creating. In the 60s, Spain turns into an industrial society, and there is a middle class. And what happens with the middle class? They have money. They have money to spend. And the young couple could go out for dinner one night and leave one girl at home to take care of children. And that girl was a babysitter. And as the industrial Spain starts to develop, so does the spread of babysitter. And what happens in the 18th and the 19th with kangaroo? Well, a kangaroo is a babysitter. So remember that the nurse is someone living in the house with the rich people. Babysitter is someone you hire for a night. And a kangaroo is someone you hire for a night, but it's someone who teaches English to children. And this is the reflection of a new society where knowledge of languages is valued. So as babysitter decreases, so increases the numbers of kangaroo. So what you can see is how studying the spread of certain words gives you a vision of what is happening in Spanish society at a level of development which is unprecedented for other decades. But if this does not seem you especially impressionant, okay, let us look at this example. This is the moment where a word was born. And I'm going to tell you the story of this. There is a political party called Podemos. It appeared in 2014. And 1 year later, those who supported Podemos were called Podemitas. And when did this word was born? This word was born on the 22nd of January in the newspaper ABC. And it was by right-wing journals. Then 6 months later, it was used by the left-wing journal El País. But on July the 18th, something happened. In a small village, the mayor of that village had a political problem because he used this term. And what happened? What happened, this was more or less the time. So here, what happens is that this fact caused the boosting of this word, Podemita. As you can see, it was profusely used by newspapers, and you can see that the trends of use are rising. And are rising for right-wing newspapers, those one here, but also for left-wing newspapers. What does this mean? That a coin word, which was just the patrimony of a certain ideological class, becomes widespread among the population. And in fact, today, everyone is called those who support Podemos, Podemitas. So you can witness how a polysemy is born or how a word is born. You cannot do this for any other century in the history of your language, I bet. Okay, but if we go from this particular case to the general problem, the problem is to what extent do sociocultural and linguistic change correlate? Is there a correlation between cultural changes and linguistic changes? And this is interesting and has been addressed by two different linguistic traditions. I'm sure you will be familiar with sociolinguistics or with historical sociolinguistics. But I don't know if you know what are called discourse traditions. In Western linguistics, there is the Anglo-Saxon tradition. They're dominant. So the ideas that come to you come from this tradition, but there are other traditions. Those traditions are not heard. And my point here is that sociolinguistic approaches to linguistic changes give us a partial approach to what is happening. And if you merge this with this discourse tradition, you get a better explanation of how linguistic changes happen. So if we go to sociolinguistics, we know about the three waves by Penelope Eckert that go from a group general study of the correlation between social traits and linguistic traits to a more individual stylistic idiosyncratic study of linguistic change. And when it comes to how do an innovation spread, the only explanation is that of models of diffusion, which is based on these S-shaped changes. What are S-shaped changes? S-shaped changes are these. Rogers in 1962 studied how innovations diffuse across society. And he said that innovation started with a small group of innovators. For instance, those who bought an electric supply in the 20s. Then there was a group of early adopters. And then this innovation becomes trend. And as a trend, the majority of the population follows it. And finally, in the last exchange, there are the laggards, those who resist to change. And if you add the number of peoples using this innovation, you can see this yellow line showing an S-shaped form. This is the theory, but if you go to practice and you see how telephone was adopted, or clothes washer was adopted, or better, how internet was adopted, you can see how this S-shaped figure happens in reality. And what sociolinguistic is proposing is that linguistic changes work this way. So for a sociolinguist, all you have to do is to look for the S-shaped path. And once you have it, everything is understood. So Blythe and Croft said, when a change in progress is robust enough, its trajectory displays an S-shaped curve, despite the variation in the behavior of individual words, speakers, text, geographical regions, or social classes over the trajectory of the change. So no matter what you're studying, words, which group of speakers you're studying, on which text, what you're going to find is always the same structure, an S-shaped graph. But this is a reductionist view because not every linguistic change produces an S-shaped graph. For instance, Octavio de Toledo studied syntactic change that did not succeed in the history of Spanish. And for changes that did not succeed, you do not have an S-shaped graph. And why this change did not succeed? Well, you have to look for what happened in the text, in the speakers, and in the words to understand this. So if you only think of speakers spreading a change, you get a very partial explanation of what happened. So can we find complementary explanation to this sociolinguistic explanation? Yes. This complementary explanation comes from European structuralism. And European structuralism is telling you that there are three levels in language. There is the universal level, which is language as a property of humankind. There is the particular level, language as a set of individual choices. But there is, and this is interesting, the historical level, where language is a set of historically determined practices. Let me explain this. This is my car. This is a 2005 Mazda. As you can see, driving is not a priority in my life. And as a car, is universal. It has all the features that a car has. But it's my car. So there are some features which only this car has. It has a bump here, someone scratched the door here. And my car today is the result of the way I used it. It's the result of the story of my interaction with it. For structuralism, languages are the result of the ways people has interacted with them and the result of the communicative needs they had. And as they had new communicative needs, they created new discourse traditions. And discourse traditions are ways of speaking historically determined. Think, for instance, of Chinese as, sorry, if I say something wrong, you correct me. As you have a strong bureaucracy, bureaucracy creates some communicative needs. So you need to write certain reports. You need to write them in a certain order. You need them to cover certain communicative needs. And this creates traditions. So your language today is also the outcome of the discourse traditions you and the speakers before you along the history of Chinese have created. And without those discourse traditions, you cannot get a proper understanding of what a language is. So it's true what sociolinguists say. Linguistic innovations are the results of an adoption, but this adoption is determined by cultural practices, which are important in the history of a language. So if we take discourse traditions into account, certain text or certain individual speakers or writers are key in the history of a language. And we all know the impact that a masterpiece of literature has on the history of a language. We are influenced by Don Quixote, and Italians by Dante, or you're influenced by the story of the soul that came from death. And if you take this into account, this could be the story of Spanish. If you take into account the writers, the main writers, and the influences between them, and you cannot understand what the language is if you don't take into account this. So if you want to understand how language in the 20th century evolved, you don't have to take into account only the raw numbers of how this feature evolved from 1910 to 1950, but you also have to take account to the social processes and to the discourse traditions that were behind them. Otherwise, you're not going to get a proper understanding of why numbers go up and down. So both approaches are complementary. Studies in diffusion are good for the groups of speakers, but every individual is the same within this group. Whereas discourse traditions study the impact of the individual authors, but cannot reach the big numbers that sociolinguistics can study. So I think the diachronic study of the 20th century can put together both strands of research, and we can benefit from quantitative methods through our extensive corpus, but also from sociological studies on group affiliation, social preference, and so on. And at the same time, highlighting the role of individuals as creators of innovations, or studies in the spread of innovation through speakers and text. So as you can see, studying the 20th century is not just an issue of data, it's not just an issue of methodology, it's a testing ground where theories can be checked. And this is what I wanted to tell you today. So in a sense, the pragmatic study of the 20th century is a way to put old wine in new wineskins, and previous linguistic descriptions can be read with new eyes. And if we do this, in that case, we can write a new page in the description of our languages. Thank you very much.
Thank you. we thank Professor Hans Barrio for this enlightening talk. This talk draws our attention to the combination of diachronic and synchronic studies of the 20th century. It is kind of combination of the factors, including individual factors, social factors, diachronic factors, and discourse traditions. So usually we would see discourse of the 20th century as synchronic, but after this talk, I'm pretty sure we really need to reassess our perspective later. So thank you for the talk, and I'm pretty sure we have people that have questions on these issues. So let's just draw some questions right from the audience. Yeah, for the audience, you can just unmute yourself to ask questions, and you could also you can unmute yourself to ask the questions, and you could also type your questions in the chatting place. Okay, both okay. Okay, so there is a question coming from Stephen. So can you see it in the chatting place? Yeah, Salvador, you can see it right in chatting place, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there are many questions here. Is the OSEA case a real diachronic change or just a variation in Lavoisian terms? Well, it's a real diachronic change because it's the development of new polysemies of a discourse marker in different discourse positions. Yes. It is a social usage by innovation diffusion or a stylistic one via media. Is there any specific evidence like those in the polymeta case other than social profile data to convince us? Specific evidences, well, the word didn't exist before. There are no records. There are records after that, and the numbers are consistent with it. Of course, this is not a definitive study, but yes, I don't know what other groups you need to convince that there is a change than the fact that something is not attested and then it is attested later. I don't know if I have answered your questions. How should we differentiate the personal stylistic usage versus social admitted usage in this kind of study? Well, this is not an easy question. And it's okay. When you have an statistical usage, this becomes in the individuals, it becomes attached to an individual. For this to become social, you need something else to foster it. For instance, I have studied this change in the case of a Spanish vocative tío, which developed in the 80s. Well, why this became a widespread vocative? Because it happened at the end of Franco's government and the beginning of the transition process. And at that time, this usage, which was particular of some musicians, of some writers, and it was a very countercultural term, crossed in transition terms, and it became a milestone of the new times. And as that usage becomes new and is opposed to the old times of dictatorship, then it goes from the individual to the social. So it's not an easy question. It's not a pass from the particular implicators to general implicators, general conversational implicators, but it's something more complex. And what we should do is to study all the elements that are implicated in those changes. I think there's another question about this Podemita. Well, this Emilio was not an influencer. He was someone who had a quarrel with another people in his town hall, and the press took this, and this became famous, and people talk in political programs about it. So they said Podemita, Podemita, Podemita. And the word that was restricted to a newspaper, to a right-wing newspaper, became widespread. So you don't need someone to be an influencer. But of course, if you're an influencer, it's easier.
Yeah. Any other questions? And you can ask yourself. Type question in the chat place. So, sorry. So I may take the liberty to ask a question. You see, for this study of diachrony of the data of the 20th century, you are depending on the corpora, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, when you were talking about diffusion of the usages, you were talking about the function of the individual. And for individuals, we have speakers and hearers, but